Awesome. Well, welcome everybody to our Sunday morning live stream. We do this every single Sunday at 8:45 a.m. in the morning. And yeah, the general breakdown is going to be... We do some Genus Brewing news, talking about news around the tap house and or news in the general beer industry. Then we go into a beer of the week where we break down a style of the week, talking about our favorite malts, hops, yeast, water profile, whatever else we want to talk about that goes into that style and making it. Then we go into two discussion topics. Those discussion topics can range all sorts of stuff, how to run a business to how to make certain styles of beer, certain techniques, whatever. And after we're done with those discussion topics, we do a Q&A. So we answer all your questions that you've had that have been burning in the back of your mind.
Oh, I thought I turned the fan off. Dang it.
Logan's really bad at turning the fan off. I'll go take care of it.
While Peter turns the fan off, I will probably get into some news. And also, for those of you that end up catching this after the fact, we also stream these as a podcast. So if you're listening in on the podcast, welcome back to the Genus Brewing Podcast. So, so let's get right into some Genus news as everyone turns in. Haircut time. Wait, what? For me or Peter? Yeah, Peter's hair is definitely...
it's getting a little shagalicious.
Needing a haircut. I am trying to grow mine out. I'm going to see how long it takes for me to look like one of the Beach Boys.
Because everything else is there. It's just the hair that's missing.
Pretty much. All right, Genus News. We have Will It Beer Season 2, Episode 2 up and live. And my guess is that most everybody that is tuning in today has already watched that. And, it was. I'm trying to make a lobster joke, but it's kind of hard to, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, lobsters? It was,
you might shell that one off to somebody else. It's the best I got.
Maybe we can clap for.
That doesn't work.
Doesn't work. No, see.
Yeah, your jokes are a little fishy.
But damn it. See. All right. I guess I'm just out of it today.
But yeah, we did. That was the first time that we actually did post a PayPal link below our Will It Beer, because that was also by far our most expensive Will It Beer. And so if people want to keep seeing those Will It Beers get bigger and better and they want to support us, there is a link on the below that they can go to and help us fund the next Will It Beer, so it doesn't take hopefully as long in between episodes.
Yeah, a link which some of you patrons already have donated to. So we really thank you for that, and especially some of them were honestly like really significant donations that I was surprised about. So
yeah, and we really appreciate that. So those of you who are doing that and helping us, produce more of those Will It Beer episodes, thank you so much for being a part of us being able to grow those and hopefully get them out to more people.
Yeah, those are by far the most entertaining and quite frankly fun videos for us to make. So
yeah.
All right, what else we got new? New light beer on tap. We have our Downtown American Lager, which kind of is self-explanatory.
It's lagerific.
It's lagerific.
It's a light beer. It's got a little bit of a German vibes to it, but overall it's kind of going for, maybe how almost pre-prohibition style. So how light lagers were when we first got over here.
Just a little bit more body than what you might expect from a Budweiser or something like that.
Exactly.
And
seltzer trials. We're starting those today, I believe.
Are we?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, yummy soda. Yeah, we are starting those either today or tomorrow, but we already have everything set up to do our seltzer trials. We're going to go Lutra on Lutra and our favorite French Saison on French Saison yeast, using a myriad of different nutrients to show you our favorite overall way to make a hard seltzer, with all the new variables that we know about accounted for.
Yeah, we got the nutrients figured out. We're going to finally be playing with the much anticipated Quake strains as well.
Yep. We're using proper pitch. We also have the White Labs seltzer nutrient, and so we're going to be doing a little bit of Omega versus White Labs experimentation at the same time.
Perfect.
Should be super fun.
All right, and and you got an appearance on the Homebrew for Life show, right?
Yeah, so the Homebrew for Life's virtual happy hour, which I forget if that's on their main channel or on their Barragecast channel. But anyways, I'll be doing a Homebrew for Life happy hour this Wednesday, and that's going to be from 6 to 8 Pacific Standard Time, PM, not AM.
So tune in for that, Homebrew for Life. Great guys over there.
Yeah.
Tyler, my only advice for you is chug some yeast slurry. You will feel much better.
Most of the yeast, yep.
Most of the yeast, yeah. And
someone's asking.
And then 5 more beers.
Someone's asking about the lobster that was cooked in the wort. Looked amazing, and it did taste amazing. Honestly, the extra sweetness from the wort game changer in the lobster world, and I feel like more people should start brewing lobster or making lobster like this.
I'm pretty sure even random customers that came in that day just like got pieces of lobster handed to them.
Yeah, we
there was a lot of lobster.
We
going
cooked
around.
10 whole lobsters that day, so it was good.
Yeah, come to Genus, you might end up with lobster.
Never know.
Never know. All right. Well, I think it's time to go on to the
beer of the week. Bum bum bum. Beer of the week. Beer. And this week's beer of the week is an English IPA. English IPA is, kind of at this point, the bastard stepchild of the IPA world in terms of how we all do it over in America.
Yeah, you never actually see, at least in America, you never see really examples of this very classic traditional style anymore.
But it is more of that old world style that, that spawned the IPA. It's the IPA that you hear all the stories about, which, by the way, aren't exactly accurate. The whole, spice trade to India thing, not 100% factual, but English style IPAs were how IPAs were probably envisioned. Much lower hop than the classic American IPA. They use different techniques. The whole body and the feel of the beer is very, very different, but it definitely still falls into that IPA category.
Yeah, and I think the whole kind of concept to walk away from an English style IPA, especially if you're trying to compare it to say kind of a classic West Coast American IPA, is you're really looking for more balance between the hop profiles and the malt profile. This is still a hop forward beer, but you want some of the unique and distinctive characteristics of an otherwise fairly simple malt bill to also be coming through behind those hops, right?
Exactly. So what we have for our malt of the week is just going to be a more flavorful malt, and we like to go pretty much anything that's going to be in that maybe floor malted world or that heritage world. We picked Baird's 1823 MOPA. If you want to see a whole video on us kind of discussing that from 2-3 years ago, comparing it to our standard Baird's MOPA, Maris Otter Pale Ale, that will be somewhere on our channel. You can look for it. But Baird's 1823 is a heritage grain that is malted by Hugh Baird's, and so it's going to have a lot more of that higher protein, a little bit of variability as well, and just a more characterful grain. So it's going to be a good medium, kind of lifting up the rest of the beer without having to add the dirty C word.
The dirty C word. And with that said, per style guidelines, you will have some caramely notes. So you might see some degree of caramel malts in there. I'm pulling up the actual color right now, so give me just a second here. I lost it on my computer for a second.
But going into how else you can get that, that caramelized notes, you can do different things with your mashing techniques, either doing a decoction, although that would be way too long for an IPA style. I would recommend against it. Or you can do my favorite thing, which is just boil this for a longer amount of time.
Yep. So, so SRM 6 to 14. So it can be anything from a very pale color all the way to like a nice sort of golden color starting to approach that amber. So what I generally recommend is, and also this is going to be, before I get too carried away, OG of 1050 to 1075. So you're looking at ABV from 5 to 7.5% on here. And so not, it's healthy in alcohol, but nothing too crazy. And final gravities of 1010 to 1018. So if you are going to add crystal malt to this, I'm going to say to try to keep it on the light side. Crystal 10, crystal 20.
Even something like caramel pills.
Yeah, even something like caramel pills.
Just going into something like with our substitutes that we've talked about, Cara Vienne, Cara Munich, those have that crystal-like note, but they're also malted in a way that gives a blend between the Maillard, like Munich-y type notes, and the crystal. So it's not as direct crystal.
Yeah, and another thing to note is despite the fact that these guys have relatively high finishing gravities, it says multiple times within the style guidelines that the mouthfeel and the body of this beer is actually quite dry. They should have a dry finish, and that comes from the hops, which are something that we'll get into in just a second, and then also the water, which we'll finish this up with. So, so keep in mind that you are wanting a dry mouthfeel, so don't get overly done on, like caramel 60 or something like that. For one, you're going to end up with probably a darker beer than you anticipated with, and you're just going to end up with too much sweetness residing in the end. Yeah,
but longer boil times, that's going to do a couple things for you besides just help darken that beer up and give you a little bit more of Maillard reaction, also depending on how hot and vigorous your boil is. Yeah. Of course, it will also also adds to clarity, which these beers are meant to be a more clear beer than especially a lot of the New England and hazy styles you see. It was part of the idea of these beers were shelf stability, and so shelf stability is increased with the longer boil time. So that's going to be an important thing. Let's go into the hop of the week, which we wanted to stray away from kind of all the hops that you'll naturally think of, your Kent's Goldings, your Challengers, Targets, your Fuggles, Willamettes, all that. And we wanted to go with something a little bit more new school that's going to give you a really good vibe, but maybe a more lampooned, more exaggerated version of what you're going to get out of an English IPA.
So yeah, we chose, get ready, it's a mouthful. It's an experimental hop from the South African breeding program. It is XJA2-436. And this is a hop that we used in an IPA a little while ago. And so its descriptor is that it has a bright lemon zest and bergamot flavor with ripe papaya, gooseberries, and cantaloupe. And I think that was actually pretty spot on. I definitely got the bergamot coming through pretty
between the bergamot and like some woodiness.
Yeah, it was just a really nice blend. Very, very herbally is the best way I could describe it. It was kind of like a nice light, zesty herbal tea sort of profile that it gave. And I think that this just will generally fall really well into the category of an English-style IPA. I think a single hop on it would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Its alphas are pretty high. They're going to run, generally 12 to 15%, with a fairly high cohumulone content too.
And the alpha is going to be really important because this is going to kind of bridge the gap between, I would say, older school and newer school hopping techniques, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But it does allow you to backload these hops a little bit and express the flavor. Maybe using a little bit less if you want to save money, or if you really want to exaggerate. Like I said, get that lampooned character of that earthy woodiness that you would expect from a classic English IPA. Backloading these hops is easier to do with those high alpha acids.
Yeah. Per style, the IBUs are actually not usually as high as you might expect them. 40 to 60 is what we're shooting for in here. And what I might say is actually shoot on the high end of that if you're using this hop in particular. And that's because traditionally in those lower alpha English hops, you're talking maybe only 4 or 5% for like East Kent Golding or Fuggle. You're going to be adding, probably a 2-ounce addition at basically like a 60-minute addition to really get that bitterness. But also you get sort of a green grassiness involved with that, which is actually appropriate to this style. But obviously if you threw 2 ounces of this hop in at 60 minutes,
then you're just some strong ale world.
way overbittered. Yeah. Like Peter said, I would backload this. You might even forgo that 60-minute addition, or even still use another varietal that's a little bit lower alphas, just to get actually more of that green material in for your bittering addition.
But there's nothing wrong with also starting your hopping at, let's say, 20 to 30 minutes.
Exactly, yeah.
And then, like I said, backloading everything from there. So that's still going to get you in the right IBU range. You're probably trying to calculate somewhere around that 70, so you can get a perceived actual 60, and really kind of pushing the upper end of that. And obviously that has a lot to do with your cool down time and your Whirlpool and everything you do with that. But if you did something like a 30-minute edition that was small, let's say a ½ ounce, and then like a 15-minute edition at 1 ounce, and then like a 5-minute edition at 1.5 ounces, and then maybe a little bit of a Whirlpool slash hop stand slash 0-minute edition, that'd probably get you in the right range with this. And like I said, the earthiness, the woodiness, that bergamot kind of flavor that's in this is going to be a lampooned reminiscence of all the earthiness that you get from the classic English style hops, and so it's going to work out pretty well.
Yeah, so, and also, based on seeing the oil content, this hop should be a little bit more stable than some of the New World hops too, which will be all the better for this beer style. I would say we're shooting for, what did you say, about 4 ounces or so total?
Yeah, 4 or 5 ounces.
Yeah, so somewhere in that 4 to 5 ounce range for, total hops that you're throwing at this beer. And yeah, so I think it would be a fun one. It might end up a little bit brighter, a little bit less green compared to your traditional hop varieties. But with that said, I don't think it would be out of the flavor profile to really throw it out of the style. So that is our hop of the week, XJA2-436.
Someone's asking how much Biofine for a 5-gallon batch. I believe that's going to be like a 1/4 ounce. It's not a lot.
Yeah, just a little tiny bit. So let's go on to our yeast of the week, and that one's pretty straightforward. That's just going to be our Fuller strain.
One of my favorite yeasts that we have.
London ESB.
NY Yeast Pub in Imperial. I don't know what it is in anything else. No, it's dry English. It's O2 English Ale in White Labs.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is in Omega if they have it.
So the London ESB strain, it's just going to push through. It's going to push that malt forward. Actually, is really what it's going to do. It's going to give you some nice fruity notes if you do ferment it. Pushing that 70-degree mark. If you do cool this off closer to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to be pretty clean fermenter. It might be a little bit sluggish. It does not like to be cold. But otherwise, yeah, it's gonna accentuate the malt. It might push forward some of that gooseberry type and cantaloupe note of the hop that we're using in this one. So should otherwise be a fantastic strain. Also, it drops bright.
It drops very bright. It's a high flocculator, which is also part of why it's finicky. So this is a yeast where it's important to do some sort of a VDK rest. So towards the end of fermentation, or when it looks like it's slowing down, go ahead and pop that up to 72 degrees, and then condition back down at your mid to low 60s.
Perfect. Yeah. And that's actually, speaking of which, that's probably another great reason why a beer like this you shouldn't even have to fine, because you should be able to turn that over and have bright beer within 3 weeks. It tends to drop out really, really nicely. So that is our yeast of the week. And
let's go ahead and pop onto the water profile of the week, which is going to be classic Burton-on-Trent. This is going to be heavy, rocky, minerally, high sulfates, all the things that kind of make your tongue tickle a little bit before you even have beer in it.
So super, super heavy. Shooting for a chloride. Or
Frazzle Penguin, thank you so much for the super chat. We appreciate it. And we missed you the last 2 weeks, too.
You are always a great commenter. So, yeah, shooting for a really high sulfate to chloride ratio, pushing through that bitterness, that sharpness, and like I said earlier, that dry mouthfeel, somewhere in that 8 to 9 to 1. Wait. Yeah, so let's just say 9 to 1 ratio of sulfate to chlorides without confusing people there. We're talking about levels. So the classic Burton-on-Trent levels are going to have 720 parts per million of dissolved sulfates to only 85 parts per million of dissolved chlorides. So really, really high ratio there. Overall, very hard profile. We're talking about 270 ppm of bicarbonates. We're talking quite a bit of sodium. Over 100 ppm of sodium in there, so quite a bit of that. High magnesium and also high dissolved calcium, which is just kind of going to come with the overall hardness of the rest of the water profile. So about as hard as it gets.
Yeah. So, and a lot of you maybe are still a little bit confused on what all you get off of just general hardness, but there is a rocky texture that happens with general hardness.
Yeah.
That comes through pretty well.
It's chalky. Is what it is. Yeah.
So it's got a little bit of actual, texture from the, from the water itself, on top of the flavor that you get from the sodium chloride that's in there and everything else.
Yeah. And I can tell you from brewing at my house that chalky minerality, it leaves this dryness on your tongue. And I think that's exactly what they're describing in the style.
Yeah.
Despite, like I said, of these beers actually having fairly high gravities and quite a bit of residual sugar, I think part of it is that chalky dryness that it's leaving on your tongue that really, really actually just kind of balances the beer out, especially if it's otherwise going to be a fairly sweeter malt backbone.
Exactly.
So,
Esteban, thank you so much for the super chat. A couple beers on you. We will take you up on that. That sounds delicious. So thank you so much. We appreciate the support.
Thank you, Esteban.
Let's go ahead and jump into our topic number 1, which is going to be old school versus new school techniques. We've kind of covered these before, and they're talked about a little bit when we do our beer myths videos that we did a while back. But there's not a lot of discussion on exactly why all these things happen. So we're going to kind of go into different things that were done pretty consistently, anywhere from a couple decades ago to a couple hundred years ago, and talk about why they're done differently today.
Yeah, this one it's gonna be a doozy. So button down your morning beers and
button down.
I don't
Most
know.
people wear
down.
Argyle vests on their morning beers, and they gotta
Argyle.
undo a couple buttons. Is that what you're saying?
I don't think I have an Argyle vest.
How do you not have an Argyle vest?
I don't.
What self-respecting person does not own an Argyle vest?
Not gonna lie,
If you
I'm
own an
trying to think
Argyle
of what
vest, raise your
Argyle
hand
is.
in the chats.
What is Argyle anyway? Okay, old school versus new school techniques. Let's go into the first one, and that is a classic one. Mashing single infusion mashes versus your classic step mashes, and we've actually done a couple videos, I think now.
Yeah.
On this, and ultimately, the classic way of brewing beer was to do step mashes, usually 2 or 3 different steps, versus nowadays for generally all grain brewing. we will just do a single infusion for a saccharification rest at about 150 degrees. And, what has changed, Peter?
The biggest thing that's changed is it's called degree of modification. And part of this is from source grains. Basically, people are planting grains differently, which means you have a lower protein content. And part of that is really refined malting techniques. And so what that means is that we can malt it to the point where the proteins are even further reduced, the enzymes are doing exactly what they need to do, and the sugar content is ready to go. So between low protein malts that we're growing and proper malting techniques, we have really, really targeted enzymes and sugars in our malt grains already that are easier to extract.
Yeah, so we got high enzyme content in there. So as soon as you give them that saccharification rest with low protein content too, you basically end up with a highly fermentable wort with low proteins in it that's ready to go with a single rest. So you really don't need to get those other rests in there to reduce the protein content, to give the enzymes more time to do their job. And yeah, I mean, we've even done experiments with like 15, 20-minute mashes and had more or less full conversion with them.
Yeah.
So that's how fast that happens now.
This isn't to say that you shouldn't ever do step mashes, because there are still reasons to do step mashes, but even under those circumstances, there's usually an out. Let's give you an example. Let's say you're using a high protein, high glucan malt bill, and you want to reduce that to make sure that you can lauter the best, or you can sparge the best.
You might be using a heritage variety malt, for instance.
For example.
Like the Baird's 1823.
So in a standard mash tun, especially if you're using one of the vertical systems like the mash and boil or the anvil foundry, those higher protein malt bills are more likely to get stuck. And so aside from rice hulls, there's not a lot of ways to kind of go around that other than doing a beta glucan rest or a low protein rest. But this day and age, we have access to enzymes such as ViscoBuster.
So yeah, we got enzymes that will do all this work for you, even at higher temperatures too. They can get in there, do their job very quickly. So really going through those 20, 30-minute rests and really adding probably an extra hour and a half to your brew day throughout these rests, you can easily bypass through the use of these enzymes. And honestly, the enzymes are pretty inexpensive too.
They're really, especially if you buy them on the scale that we buy them by the liter. And I say we're probably using, for 1 barrel batch, we might be using like $1.50 worth of enzymes.
Exactly. So, so very inexpensive enzymes. For a small batch, you're only putting in a few milliliters of these things, and they do their job very quickly, very efficiently. So yeah, that's a great way to bypass those classic step mashing if you want to have, super, super low protein content beer, and you want to maximize your overall mash efficiency.
Yeah, even the acidification that can happen in certain stages of step mashing, which does affect how your yeast ferment, there are also other ways around that, including raw
lactic acid.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a really easy way to just be like, boop, lactic acid.
There's a couple questions that I want to get to before we lose them in the final end. One is thoughts on target, archer, and gesture for an English IPA combo. That's from Jimmy. I think that sounds pretty classic. The Archer and Jester obviously going to be a little bit more removed from that. Target's obviously classic, but and then there's one more that I wanted to talk about. Do we have any videos where we discuss braggots or ginjo? Braggots, yes. We did a whole live stream with Thomas Croskery talking about braggots. The ginjo beer, which is a beer sake hybrid, I have never even heard of. So
whoa, might have to try that one of these days.
Doing it. All right, let's go on to secondary fermenters versus univessels.
Which somebody actually had commented on that. It was,
old school, secondary, contemporary, don't need it. Yeah,
perfect. There you go. So
you read our minds.
And this is a great one. I don't know why people, I guess they're reading old books now.
You're right, yes.
And secondary is something that we've actually addressed several times. Secondary was generally an old homebrew practice. That was
and
done.
Commercial brew practice.
Yeah, and commercial, I guess, yeah. But it was done, throughout the 70s, 80s, even into the 90s. And a lot of that came down to the fact that we had absolute crap for yeast. Nowadays, our yeast is fantastic. We get quick fermentations. And quite frankly, the beer styles that we're brewing these days will actually have a negative impact from trying to rack them into a secondary fermenter. and so instead we use univessels.
There are a couple of risks that come on with doing primary to secondary, even in the commercial brew world, it's still done quite often. Mostly that's for money and space saving, and so people will have a primary and a secondary tank, the secondary being the bright tank before you get into kegs, and basically by using both of those, you're doubling your brewing capacity. That said, although unitanks are more expensive, if you just buy double the amount of unitanks instead of buying a fermenter and a bright tank, you're probably increasing your your upfront cost by maybe 20%, but you're also decreasing labor over time and giving yourself fewer risks when it comes to things like oxygen pickup.
Yeah. So on a commercial scale, you basically see unitanks all over the place now. So they're going to just generally work better, especially for hazy IPAs, especially when it comes to that oxygen. Without a lot of difficulty, it's very very hard to transfer beer, say for instance, from one glass carboy to another one, using it as a secondary vessel without ingressing any kind of oxygen in there that can be deleterious to the quality of the beer. So that's
pumpernickel. I can say long words too.
Pumpernickel. So that's really where unitanks shine. The whole process is being done in one vessel. You can do yeast dumps. You can dump out any kind of dry hop additions, and on top of that, you're also reducing your risk of infection and contamination, right?
Especially on the home scale where you're going from something like a brew bucket to a carboy. That's all the extra contact area on your carboy that you need to make sure is both clean and sanitized, and all the possible air pickup just in transferring from primary to secondary, which has a bigger impact than you might think.
Yeah. So lastly on this topic, at least for the secondary one, another big reason why we used to transfer into secondary was for a clarification stage. What it used to do is allowed a little bit of oxygen to kick the yeast back up, made sure your fermentation was complete, and then allowed that yeast to really settle out. And again, when it comes to sort of enzymes and just new tools that we have at our disposal, there is a ton of different clarifiers out there. We've got a whole video where we cover those and some of our favorites. Using clarifiers now instead of a secondary, you can basically get the same job done with minimal, if not, even a negligible impact on the flavor of the beer, and you can clarify within a matter of days instead of a matter of weeks.
Someone says he likes a good secondary. More cleaning to do, more oxygen, the best of beering.
The best of beering. So yeah, that ultimately is why you see more and more people transferring over to univessels, or at least skipping the concept of a secondary in general. Maybe even letting that happen in the keg.
Yeah.
Or
if you are going into bottles or kegs, the one thing that you have to know is that you're probably going to get a little bit of sedimentation pickup going into the bottle or keg. That's not a big deal. Once it crashes out, it sticks to the bottom of both the bottle and the keg. So if you're in a bottle, you just got to pour until the slurry starts to come. If you're in a keg, you just got to pour off the first couple draws from each beer, basically, and then you should be pouring clear beer after that.
So there you go. So that is secondary fermenters, old school versus univessels, new school. Let's go on to temp control versus yeast choice.
Temp control was the biggest, I would say, stopgap behind a lot of people not making great beer for the longest time, especially on the home scale.
This is kind of a really interesting thing, and this has actually evolved just within the last year, maybe 2 years. So it used to be that if you say, for instance, a lager, I guess is the best example. People used to think if you really want to make a true lager, you've got to ferment cold. You've got to control that temp fermentation down in the mid 50s, and it's got to go through a long fermentation period. And then, I don't know, half a dozen years ago, we figured out that the Bohemian lager strain can actually ferment clean at warm temperatures.
Hybridize is what happened.
Yeah. So we actually figured a lot of lager strains are now hybrid strains.
Which, it was just kind of a natural occurrence that happened over several years of being built in commercial breweries, but then people started experiencing the Bohemian lager strain, the Feinsteffen lager, experimenting with that at warmer temperatures, and it still makes a very clean beer.
Yeah. So we kind of figured out, well, shoot, you can actually use that at ale temperatures, still makes a very clean beer. You lager it in the bottle or keg for a few weeks, and you end up with a very similar product. And then even more recently...
Someone beat us to it.
Yeah, exactly. So we've experimented with Quake strains, and there's specifically one from Omega, and it's called the Lutra Strain. And that strain will ferment clean even at like 80-degree temperatures. And it actually creates, I wouldn't call it like a perfect lager profile. It'd be fun to do a real side-by-side with it.
Yeah.
But it creates a stupendously clean beer that to anybody but a professional could easily pass as a fantastic lager.
So we've been a proponent for this for a long time. Nowadays, when people come in and they're asking about yeast choice or they have a recipe, even if the recipe is a lager recipe and it has a certain yeast on it, let's say it has the Urquell strain on it, for example, I will make a point to ask them what temperature they plan on fermenting at, and we can choose the yeast that works well with their temperature rather than trying to fit what they can do into what yeast they have on the recipe.
So so at that point, it's one of those great things because temperature control, while the nice thing about temperature control in a modern sort of sense is that if you say you have a uni-tank that you can control the temperature on, you can actually crash the beer in that uni vessel, and if it's pressurizable, you can actually carbonate it or spund it within that vessel, save on some CO2, and essentially have bright, drinkable beer going straight into your serving vessel, which is how we do it on the commercial side. But again, that's usually a $1,000 investment is more or less what you're looking at these days if you do want to get a small glycol chiller, which has actually come down a lot.
Yeah.
Like the last five years ago, that would have been a $2,000 investment. Now it's basically halved in the price, and we have some fantastic homebrew scale glycol chillers available on the market. We even carry one here. So that is an option. But again, it's $1,000 that you could easily bypass by just choosing the right yeast strains. So yeah, feel free to shoot us a message if you want to know kind of what the best strains are too.
Reverend KY is asking, is Lutra better than Global? And that's a loaded question. I'm going to go with a flat no. Global's still the beast. It is.
It is a beast.
It works all the way up to most room temperatures, and so Lutra, you actually have the opposite problem where it's not going to work very well unless you can get it up to that higher temperature. Yeah. Lutra's a great option on the commercial scale if you don't want to worry too much about temperature control, because on the commercial scale, the relative heat of the fermenter itself that's created by fermentation is a lot bigger of a spike because it's so well insulated, and whereas on the home scale you might regulate within 3-4 degrees or something like that. Yeah. So Lutra, you have to get up to that 80, 90 degree even temperature range for it to do its thing. It can probably still do it at 70, but at that point just use Global.
Yeah. And I mean, you can sort of go the opposite direction too. So say you're wanting, it's cold, it's wintertime, and you want something that's not super clean. You want to get some actual esters.
Some ale, yeah.
Some ale. A strain like either the K97 or General German Ale strain is also a fantastic one that I fermented down into the upper 50s on a couple different occasions. I had one of those that actually fermented at like 57 degrees. Still fermented out completely, took it an extra week to finish, but still produced the result that I was going for, gave the profile I was looking for. So depending on what you're doing, there is a strain out there for every temperature is I guess what we're getting at.
Yeah.
So, yep. So that is temp control versus yeast strain choice.
Let's go into long boil versus short boil. And so we've mentioned long boils on a lot of episodes, a lot of videos. And we've mentioned long boils because long boils are good for certain flavor development components and also for shelf stability. But there are a lot of styles that you're really trying to avoid that shelf stability and the things that come along with that. And there's a lot of styles that actually don't need the extra Maillard reaction or the extra flavor development that comes from it. Yeah,
so when he says styles, he's talking about one.
Well, no, you could get away with let's say like American wheat beer or something like that.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
But the big one is obviously the New England IPA.
Yeah, the New Englands, the hazies, all of those new school IPAs that you want to have a really, really nice light color in order to get that orange juice-esque shine to them. Keeping the color light. A shorter boil, you're going to have less Maillard reactions in there.
You're going to keep those haze-forming proteins in suspension.
You're going to keep the haze-forming proteins in suspension. So you're just going to get a more protein-rich beer. And I think one thing to address on the long boil side, I don't think we would cover it properly without addressing it, is that whole concept of DMS and Pilsner malts.
So DMS was a lot more common with different malting practices that happened a long time ago. Again, with highly modified malts, there's fewer precursors to DMS, fewer SMM, S-methylmethionine, that go into the malting process. And through the malting process in contemporary grains, most of the SMM is converted to DMS and then also volatilized. And so you don't end up with to the flavor threshold level of SMM or DMS in your grains today, unless you have DMSO. And DMSO actually comes from improperly stored malts, so that comes from some sort of moisture content reacting so that it oxidizes faster in the storage process. So if your malt is relatively fresh and or if it's stored properly, even for a couple of years, there isn't a risk of DMS in your beer, even with a short boil.
So yeah, so don't be afraid if you want to cut, even if you're doing maybe not a classic Pilsner, but even if you're using Pilsner malt, we should say, in your hazy, don't be afraid to cut that boil back to 45 minutes or even 30 minutes. Did we do a 20-minute boil once?
We've done a 15-minute. We've done a boil that just went to hot break and then went down.
Yeah. So and we've never pulled any DMS or any of those short boil associated off flavors.
Zero canned peas in our beer.
So it's just something that to consider with the new malts these days. You don't need that old style. And then the other thing with a short or a long boil that traditionally we needed it for was actually pulling bitterness from the hops. And I think actually a great example of this is the classic English IPA, where we had low alpha hops. And we were trying to pull a lot of bitterness from them, so we wanted to boil those hops for longer to get better utilization. Again, going back to the Nipas, the hazies, we don't want to pull that bitterness from. We're using these high alpha hops.
And even talking about the English one we were just talking about, we're backloading a lot of those grains.
Using a high alpha hop, you don't have to. You can backload those up. There's no point in really, at least in our opinion. I'm sure there's other people that are doing it differently, but for hazy IPAs, there's no point in adding any hops in the boil itself. You can easily achieve the results you're looking for by adding all the hops post boil.
Exactly. We've done a lot of really good. Yeah. I'm going to stop right now. It can work. It's good. We've made good beer out of it. Trust us.
Sounds good.
Talking's not a strong suit of ours. Okay, so let's talk about boil hopping versus Whirlpool / dry hopping.
Speaking of hopping, I guess I kind of already talked about that.
Already went into that.
Already went into that. Yeah.
So boil hopping is kind of remnant in the IPA world. How we hopped and how the beer styles kind of formed had a lot to do with how the end consumer was getting their beer. And so a lot of the big breweries back in the day were kind of planning for a wide distribution area. And so with a wide distribution area, they needed to make sure that their beers were shelf stable.
Yeah. Which is smart even today.
It is.
And one of the downsides to hazy IPAs is that they're highly, highly unstable. My general timeline I tell people is 6 weeks. 6 weeks from the day a beer is kegged up, that's a hazy.
Yeah, specifically for hazy IPAs.
Yeah, specifically for hazies. You've got basically a 6 week timer that's counting down, and after 6 weeks, that beer has already started to lose a significant amount of its flavor, amount of its punch, specifically on the aromatic side.
Even when stored properly. So let's say it's not getting into trucks at warm temperatures. It's not going through warehouse transfers and being agitated while getting warmed up. It's not going through a lot of different chains that's making this happen. This is 6 weeks if it's in perfect conditions the entire time. So beer, hazies, IPAs, and distro. There's a reason a lot of people put that pressure on quick turnaround or a lot of hype behind big releases. They want that beer gone and drank really, really fast.
Yeah. And this is why you actually see more hazies from small breweries on tap, because they're doing smaller batches. They know they can turn over. They know they have control over how that beer is stored. And the hazies that you do see in big distro just don't tend to be as good because, unfortunately, 6 weeks would be an incredibly fast turnover for a keg or even a case of bottles to actually go through that distribution chain, get put out in a store, and be bought by a consumer. In
that way, I think the hazy IPA or the New England style IPA might have been one of the biggest progresses that has been made supporting small breweries, craft breweries, your neighborhood breweries. We can do a whole video on how the New England IPA kind of helped elevate the small brewery market.
Yeah.
Hit like right now if you want us to do that.
Hit like. And then, the other thing, too, why, you used to see more hops added to the boil, and why we do actually still with the bigger breweries that do have these, widespread distribution chains, is that you're already boiling off those volatile aromatics, and what you end up left with are more stable compounds in the beer that have a longer shelf life. So say instead of 6 weeks, they're going to be good for usually 2 or 3 months, assuming that they're being stored properly, and still have a generally tasty profile. And this is going to be more like your Northwest style IPAs is kind of what comes to mind.
Or your English style IPAs.
Or your English style
which again,
IPAs.
were designed to be out there for a while.
Exactly. We forgot to tell about Brett too. We totally spaced on that.
Meh, we'll get into it later.
Yeah, we'll get to it later. And then lastly, when it comes to hops and why we see so much hop additions that have been later, and this is probably a thing that's happened over the course of the last 30 years, so this is kind of a longer term thing, is that we've had all these newer hop varieties come out, and their general oil content, their general alpha acids, which give you that bittering, just keep on going up and up and up, to the point where we were bittering with 8% Centennial hops 30 years ago, where nowadays we've got
even Centennial was lower back then.
Yeah,
Centennial was probably like 6%.
Yeah, so nowadays we've got Summit, and we've got all the cryo hops that are pushing, that are usually in those mid-teens. Even any of the New World hops are usually in the 10 to 15% alpha acid.
And even the lower alpha acid ones, they still have higher total oil content. And so you've got hops that are 5 to 6% alpha acids that can still get 2 to 3 milligrams per liter total oil, which is juicy. That's a lot of oils.
Super oily. Generally speaking, if we try to boil those hops, we're just going to end up with overly bittered beer. And obviously, from what the consumer's given feedback on, given the wild success of the hazy IPA, people like hop flavors, but they don't necessarily like bitter beer.
Yeah. So let's support our local craft breweries, and let's if you're going to get a New England IPA / if you chase those big juicy IPAs, get them from the source.
All right. So for our second topic today, let's talk about grains, and specifically how we are going to crush them. I believe that Peter came up with this idea because we have a lot of people that come in here and they specifically ask us to double crush their grains, when the reality is we have a 3-roller mill, so it already double crushes the grains. But they sort of have this mindset that it's going to improve their efficiency, when the reality is that for most cases it doesn't, right?
Right. So there's a big kind of misunderstanding when it comes to how grain crush actually impacts your beer, especially depending on your beer style. A lot of people will think, if you do brew in a bag, you need a finer crush, which is true to an extent, but there's a certain level of fineness that you really don't want to go beyond. And people don't necessarily understand how grain crush works and how it impacts your beer. So the finer doesn't always mean better, and a lot of that gets into system-dependent brewing.
Yeah, and this is going to depend on a few things. I've got the notes I've got here is, which I guess is just a general correlation, but the shallower the grain bed, the finer of a crush you can usually get away with. There's less compaction in the grain bed, and so you don't really have that compaction going against you when it comes to getting stuck sparges.
This also goes into sparging technique. So if you have a shallow grain bed, but you're sparging with water headspace instead of having a good skirt of water that's going around the entire grain bed, so you're not having the same turbulence, the same motion from that, then that can also have a negative impact. And so having a super fine crush, you actually need a relatively efficient way to mash and sparge, or else you might be losing efficiency instead of gaining efficiency. I know a lot of people that get their own mill, they tighten that mill to the finest possible setting and do a double crush on that, and their efficiency goes down for that exact reason.
Yeah, you end up with what's called channeling in your grain bed, and that just means that the water finds its way through it in the easiest way possible, and this can also happen actually if you are sparging or lautering too quickly. You can end up with channeling, and what it means is that instead of gently going through the grain bed, rinsing those sugars out, you end up just going through one spot and leaving a bunch of sugars behind.
So speaking of that compaction and that channeling, and the rate of sparge isn't the only thing that affects it. Also the the springiness of the grain bed, or the way that the grain bed is fluffed or separated, which usually comes from holes, can also impact whether or not you start channeling.
Yeah, if you crush finer, you're generally going to tear those holes up more, which actually compacts the grain bed even more. So you sort of get this like double thing going against you when it comes to finer crushing. So yeah, generally speaking though, if you have a shallow grain bed, you can get away with a finer crush. If you have a deeper grain bed, and I'm talking about deep as in even some of these all-in-one systems, you probably want to go with a coarser crush on them. This might only be 12 or 16 inches deep, whereas if you have how the larger systems get away with it, that end up with several feet deep of grain bed, they actually utilize a mash rake. Which is a way to kind of keep all that grain bed fluffed up. It keeps it from compacting, and they actually will still, with that mash rake, a lot of them will crush to a coarser degree. And the reason they can get away with this is because having that turbidity from the mash rake also kind of increases the contact of the surface area, I guess.
Yeah, so it increases the enzymes and increases the water. So the water basically delivering the enzymes to the starches that need to be broken down, as well as the water contact with the sugars once they are in a soluble state. And so the water is dissolving more sugars, and you are able to get a better pull off of your grain without risking pulling things like beta glucans and haze forming proteins.
Yes, you said that much better than I would have. Thank you.
You're welcome. And this also goes into, so let's say you can't super powder your grain, which we'll talk about what you can get off of if you can super powder your grain, super fine crush in a little bit. But let's say you can't. Let's say you have a medium to a coarse crush. Is that necessarily going to give you less efficiency? No.
Yeah, so it depends on your system. So what the super big guys do, what's the one that comes to mind? Full Sail Brewing Company. Down in the hood, they actually they brew on I think it's a 600 barrel system.
Yeah.
It's stupidly big. So they turn all of their grains into powder, and then the way they actually maximize their efficiency, they have a giant squeezer. So they mash this powder, they run it into a squeezer, and they basically squeeze it through these filter plates. Squeeze out all that nice sugar water, and they get like stupidly good efficiencies out of it.
Nearly 100%.
But obviously this isn't feasible on a homebrew scale. So I guess our main point to kind of start this all out with is that it's really system dependent.
And so if you have, you're going to have a coarser crush, or for us, it's going to be you have the crush that we give you, which is a relatively fine crush, but not super fine. Yeah. So it's just barely finer than medium is what we give everybody, because it's still, you want to make sure that all your holes are still intact, but there are still some kernels that are visible. And so you need to do everything you can to basically maximize the contact of water to your crush, which could involve stirring your mash during the mash. And it also could just be involving a longer mash or a shorter sparge.
Yeah. And I actually encourage
or slower sparge.
I actually encourage people to stir their mash, 2 or 3 times throughout the mashing process.
In the first, especially in the first 30 minutes.
Yeah, and really, this probably has more of an impact on temperature than anything else. It'll just help equalize the temperature within your mash. Most people, for their mash tuns or whatever they're mashing in, you're going to have some cold spots and some hot spots in there. So really that'll just help maximize the enzymes and let them do what they're designed to. So I know there's probably other sources out there that'll tell you not to stir it, but I don't see any reason why you wouldn't, as long as you're going to louder it a little bit and do some vorloffing to make sure that you're not just pulling a bunch of proteins or grains out of there. So
yeah. Talking about proteins, one thing that a lot of people don't really understand is that moisture and protein content can actually have an effect on the fracture of the grains.
Yeah.
And so how the grains crush up, moisture and protein content can have that. And so if you have a higher protein content or a higher moisture content grain, which is a lot of your specialty grains, crushing them too coarse can make it so that they're harder or slower to dissolve in your mash, which again, you can equalize with a longer mash if you want to have more consistent quality of product at the very end. But also crushing them too fine can have the opposite effect. And so you can get certain... So especially in higher protein malts, you can get certain things in your boil that you don't want.
Yeah, I know personally I've had some grains that have sat in some really humid environment for a relatively short period of time actually too. And those, when I ran those through the mill, they did not crush worth a damn. And sure enough, I had terrible efficiency on that batch. And I almost wonder if to some extent some of those enzymes, weren't good anymore too from sitting in that superhuman environment. So that is a big part of it, keeping your grains stored properly, and then also paying attention to the protein content and adjusting your mills accordingly.
Homebrew for Life, by the way, I told everyone about the Wednesday thing happening at the beginning of this, so if you want to let them know a little bit more on that.
Short ribs? Are we doing a short ribs beer?
Eventually, yeah. So
every wib just needs to produce lunch for us from now on out.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to go with short ribs and the sous vide style, only because I'm going to throw them in the mash while I'm mashing. Hour at 150 degrees. That sounds good, right? That'll work. All right, let's go on to... So we talked about older malts, higher protein malts will work better with a medium crush. So those higher protein malts, like I said, if you have, heritage malts, or if you have malts that, are going to have higher protein, which also means more character, a fine crush can actually be detrimental. A lot of those older styles were built and developed off of, again, everything that makes them shelf stable, and that means everything that makes them clear too. And so that longer mash time, that better contact, that better Vorlauf, which we haven't really talked too much about. So that clarification step, just by recirculating your mash, is actually going to benefit those higher character malts a lot more than if you do a super fine crush and just try to maximize the efficiency.
Yeah, you want to keep those enzymes in close contact with all the other starches, the proteins that are kind of built into those grains. So if you crush them too fine, let's say you're doing a brew in a bag even, would be probably like the worst case scenario. You dip that bag in, all those proteins start settling down to the bottom. Your enzymes are still up with the rest of the grains, and they're just not going to quite have that contact time and be able to do their job properly. So, a little bit coarser crush can definitely help you out there.
Yeah. Holes can break up. We already talked about that. So if you are doing a brew in a bag, or if you are doing a short lauter time, or something that involves a lot of stirring so that you can maximize your efficiency, there are chances of certain proteins and beta-glucans getting into your beer, which we talked about how that can be negative. It can give you extra bitter components. It can also make your beer less shelf stable. It can reduce your hop sedimentation. It can also increase your risk of oxidation throughout the fermentation process. All those things can happen with proteins and beta-glucans, but there are techniques that can get those out. What I'm talking about with those techniques are going to be, boil finings, they're going to be fermentation finings, and also they're going to be closed system or pressure fermentation.
Perfect. All right. Well, is that it for the topic number 2?
I believe so.
I see the general takeaway, I guess, from this topic is going to be that finer does not always mean better.
I would say, as a general rule, I would say the styles and the techniques that allow you to do a finer allow you to do a finer crush, or at least maximize the finer crush, really lend themselves towards more neutral, or I would say the larger scale commercial styles of beer, which isn't always the styles you want to brew. Sometimes it is, like the full sales.
Yeah.
The things that are, really lend themselves towards that medium crush, the long boil time, the slow lauter time, all that stuff. Those are the things that can make certain more characterful, at least in the malt side, beers.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think the technique of your mash, your lauter, your boil, everything that goes into the beer is going to have a bigger effect than just whether or not you're crushing fine or you're crushing coarse.
You crushing so fine, girl?
Yep. All right, so I think now is the time we can finally open things up to general questioning. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around.
Throw those questions out. By the way, we will not answer your question if you haven't already hit like. So
yes,
if you haven't done that,
hit the like button.
Do it now.
Also, if you guys want to support us, shameless plug here, we do have a website, genusbrewing.com, and we have some awesome swag, some recipe kits up there. Thank you, everyone, by the way, last week for ordering those kits. I know we had a few perfect Pilsner kits that went out, which we basically take out all the guesswork for you and give you everything you need to do a classic traditional Pilsner. So thank you, everyone, for bought those. That always goes to helping more of these videos. So
how do you recommend getting a gravity reading in your fermenter when it has no spigot? Very quickly. Sanitize everything very quickly. Try to pump some CO2 in that. Mostly, I just don't take a gravity reading until I'm bottling or kegging, though.
We got Funky Brewer is asking, I'm kind of going backwards, by the way.
Good. I'll go from the top down. You go from the bottom
up. He's asking if you stir the whole mash or just the top third of the grain bed. And I think that's kind of what I was getting at. And I would stir the whole mash, honestly.
Stir the whole mash for the first 20, 30 minutes. And then after that, just go into Vorloff step. So that's the clarification step.
Yeah. Yeah. Usually within the first 20 to 30 minutes, you've actually got full conversion. And at that point, you're just trying to extract a few of those sugars into solution. So that's really the only reason why we still do 60-minute mashes, speaking of which.
Are we adding the enzymes to the beginning of the mash? Yes. So if we're adding mash enzymes, they go right in at the beginning. Unless we're adding enzymes because we accidentally overshot our mash temperature, in which case we'll wait until the mash temperature drops to where we want it, and then we'll add the enzymes and continue on as if nothing happened.
That's another great reason to have them, because I know, especially in my earlier days, I overshot mash temperatures a few times, and I was like, crap, trying to get some cold water in there, and then of course you just chase it.
We overshoot mash temps all the time. It happens.
How much does a Herms or rim system increase efficiency? They don't, actually, for the most part. It depends really on I don't care what system you have. It just depends on how well you have it dialed in.
Mash shape and lauter technique have way more of an impact. The Herms rim systems are really good if you want to do step mashing. So I guess they will help you in the fact that your sparge can be more fluid. If you can do a mash out, basically get your mash up to 165, 170, your sugar water will be less viscous. Even that's still beer dependent, but the biggest reason to have one is to do step mashes, not necessarily to increase efficiency.
Yeah, it's easy to fall into that efficiency chasing trap. I know I did, and I just over and over again, I can't tell people enough. Shoot for consistency, don't shoot for efficiency. So just try to get the same numbers every time you brew instead of trying to get the best efficiency possible. So.
Ooh, someone did a Lutra Baltic Porter. Sounds interesting.
That sounds really good.
Do you have to diacetyl rest with Lutra? No. And you also don't have to diacetyl rest with Global if you ferment warm enough.
Yeah. So diacetyl rests are only going to be necessary if you are doing a cold fermentation. When I say cold, generally anything under 60 degrees ish Fahrenheit. Your diacetyl, your VDK rest is going to happen within a day or two of just finishing fermentation, anything above 50 degrees. So,
somebody has a 1 gallon Pilsner that they brewed a while back and it got stuck fermentation. What will happen if they add Brett? Brett fixes everything. Do it and let it sit for forever.
Fixes everything. Yeah. Oh, speaking of Brett, I think now's actually a good time to address that too. We skipped over on the English IPA beer of the week that a lot of those actually would be finished off with Brettanomyces as well, which can lend additional character to that dryness. So and a little bit interest. So I would say if you want to experiment with that, I would actually throw some Brettanomyces in at about 50 to 60% attenuation. During your fermentation, and you can.
Even if you throw it in at with the primary pitch, it's still going to go a lot slower.
Yeah, I guess you could throw it in a primary. It just depends on how much you want. If you want like super delicate, throw it about halfway through. If you want to get a really nice blend of some Brett with your traditional yeast strain, then you can throw it in at the beginning.
Here's a good one. Recommended yeast to ferment high gravity IPA in 60-degree weather.
High gravity IPA, 60-degree weather.
I would actually probably say something like Scottish ale. Scottish ale is going to be a strong fermenter. It can go down to 56 degrees. I would still recommend a big starter, and I recommend agitation. So if it's going to sit at 60 to 63, let's say, when it's actively fermenting, still agitate it within every day or a couple times a day for the first 3-4 days.
Or even that German ale strain too.
Yeah, German ale will work pretty well too.
Yeah, that'd be
or Global.
You could do, it depends on how high. I mean, if it's over 10%, maybe not the Global, but yeah, I mean, either one of those depends on how clean you want it, really. I like the idea actually of the Scottish strain. That might be really good.
Yeah. Someone says thoughts on boiling hops and water separately while mashing to shorten the brew day. Not having sugar compounds in your wort actually does change the solubility of the hops. So some of those act as, so obviously a lot of the oils aren't purely water soluble. And so boiling the hops in those water isn't going to help with any sort of flavor retention from there. So you'll get a different flavor. If you just want alpha acids and you're boiling, let's say, Warrior in water, sure. But having that sugar as a as kind of a buffer or a solvent a little bit will actually change the solubility of oils, and so you'll get better flavor if you just boil your beer normally.
All right, we got a question from Jimmy. He's got a really good one. So he is asking about adding extra nutrients to a hop plant to potentially increase its oil content. And I don't know specifically about the nutrients, but what I do know is that the bigger impact, or at least one of the biggest impacts on total alpha acids or hop oils, come from the relative humidity during during, well, at least in the northern hemisphere, for here it's like during midsummer, like July or something like that, right when they're starting to change from their growth phase to setting their cones. If you happen to have really high humidity during those weeks, I know the hops will actually have a higher oil content. And as for the reasoning behind that, I'm not sure. It was just a study that I read on it, and it was really interesting, kind of a little tidbit there. So
go breathe on your hops a lot.
Go breathe on your hops. Yeah, I was like, I doubt you're growing them indoors like you would marijuana. That's what they're asking, kind of the relative. But yeah, high humidity equals high oil content.
Homebrew for life. You're my #1 fan. Yeah, you are.
Thanks, man.
See you Wednesday. Everyone else is gonna watch too, right? Raise your hand if you're gonna watch the Wednesday happy hour, virtual happy hour with Homebrew for Life. 30-day shelf life says, that's not a thing. That's not a question. That's just a statement.
We got.
What are your thoughts on cold chain distribution, i.e., only using distributors that can keep beer cold from the brew house to store fridges? I would select for that. I know it's going to be a little bit more expensive, but in my mind, it's not worth.
Want your beer warming up.
Yeah, it's not worth doing distro. Yeah, unless you're really selective about your beers. So let's say you're only distroing certain sours or barrel aged stuff, in which case you're probably not going to make a lot of money from distro anyway. You got to make sure that your distributors are doing their thing. Be selective.
Dan says, what about keg hopping? Oh God, stay away.
In corny kegs especially, don't hop in your kegs. I mean, if you have a really good filtering mechanism, it can be fine.
I was gonna say, actually, I take that back. Yes. So,
but you also have to be drinking your beer quickly. So that's
I threw pellet hops straight into a keg once. I'm sure other people have done that, and that's probably the last time they'll do that.
That's a great way to clog your poppets or get your poppets stuck.
That's exactly what happened.
It's also a great way to get grassiness if you don't drink your beer super quickly. And if you do have a way to get those hops out of there, that's only a way to increase oxygen. So there's better ways to do hopping into the keg or post-fermentation, like inline hopping, if you can rig that up. But
I would say the only half success we had was when we had one of those little torpedo tubes that we put like an ounce of cryo hops in and threw that into a corny keg. But again, that was something that we drank that beer within like 3 weeks.
Yeah, and it tasted really good in the keg.
So yeah, and it did. It was actually, the interesting thing was that it really slowly infused into the keg because the temperature was so cold. And so it actually changed over the course of about 2 weeks. That was kind of fun. So if you do have like a really good filter mechanism, I can see doing it with some cryo hops or some of the lupulin type hops. I would generally avoid that practice. It's just too hard to get the hops out of it.
Homebrew for Life is asking if we can create a GoFundMe for a Mach-3 razor for you. John, thank you so much for the super chat. We appreciate you. Appreciate the support.
Wouldn't do nothing on this.
It just gets stuck. It'd rip your face off first.
I'd just be wearing them like a little like Christmas tree, little ornament stuck in there. I did once lose a pen in my beard.
Frazzle Penguin. Don't hop in my keg. I can't fit.
Need a bigger keg, Frazzled Penguin. Get yourself a Kilderkin.
There we go.
I could probably fit in a Kilderkin.
You could probably fit in most kegs. Logan can probably fit in a corny keg. He's pretty small. Speaking from Eastern Europe, have you guys heard of Mikkeller's Year of Lager campaign? I haven't heard of Mikkeller's Year of Lager campaign. Tell me more. Is it possible to drop a stuck IPA 1035 after kegging? Yes. Especially if you have, it depends on the age in terms of how well this is going to work, but either a combination of enzyme or enzyme and fresh yeast can still drop that. The thing you have to worry about is obviously risking oxidation, so you got to be really careful with how you add enzyme and fresh yeast, but it's definitely doable. What do you think about White Labs WLP 051 California 5 for a low session IPA? California 5 is, I think it's a blend. I'm not as familiar with Wyatt Labs as I am Yeast and Imperial, but
I'll do it.
if it's a blend that's got the 1272 and the American ale in it, I would say you definitely want a low fermentation temperature. So you're aiming for like 64 to 66. And all together, I think that those yeasts will work really well in a session IPA.
It might be 051. Yeah, California 5. Similarities to an English strain. More similarities than the WP 001. Showcasing notes of cherry, apple, complement blondes and browns.
Okay, so that might be...
Sounds kind of like the Ale 2.
Yeah, American Ale 2, yeah.
Strain, and...
that's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, don't quote me on it, but yeah, I can see that working well.
Someone's asking, what's the deal with caramel malts? Why should we avoid it? So we kind of gripe on caramel malts a lot just because we see them overused in the homebrew world. And so we're not actually telling people to never use caramel malts whenever we say that. We're just trying to create the stigma around it that people know that there are just as good, if not better options from more dynamic malts. And so we see it way too overused in a lot of homebrew recipes and a lot of the beers that people bring in. And we just want people to understand that there's ways to make better, more complex, and more flavorful beers without using crystal malts.
Yeah, and I think, and to me, it's not even necessarily the use of them. You can use them for color adjustments and all kinds of things, but it's usually just such high percentages that we see.
Yeah,
you're talking
people using 2 pounds in a 5-gallon batch.
Yeah, I would say if you're putting caramel malt in pretty much any style, it shouldn't be more than like 5% of your total grain bill. Yeah,
and we're not trying to. And even though if you're trying to get like color correction, I like the darker end of the malt spectrum for color correction, and the lighter end of the caramel malt spectrum is also honestly pretty good. But we're trying to. Basically, our goal when we're putting out this information isn't necessarily to stigmatize anything or shame anybody for doing anything, but it's to, I guess, poke the bear in a little bit that makes everyone that listens to us make better beer. And so if you know that if you have that stigma in your mind of like, oh, maybe I don't have to use caramel malts, we hopefully can be pushing you to brew something just a little bit more dynamic or a little bit more thought-provoking than
I think why you see so many recipes is because, if you have a recipe that was even made, say, 15 years ago, we had a small degree of base malts, we had roasted malts, and we had caramel malts. Yeah. Right? And that was kind of all we had to work with. But nowadays, I mean, there's literally probably 1,000 different maltsters out there making, 10, 20 varieties of malt each to go from. So there's no really reason why you can't find an amazingly tasty base malt and find some other really unique malt. And it might even be, sort of just like a hybrid caramel malt with some kind of biscuit malt that'll just give you a little bit more nuanced flavor.
Someone's asking what's the benefits to using acid malt over lactic acid to reach pH correctness when mashing. A couple different things. First is going to be it's a little bit easier to fine tune because you can use a higher percentage of it, and so it's not a difference between like a milliliter and 1.2 milliliters is going to drop your pH too much or something like that. The second reason is because the lactic acid is produced naturally, and so it also comes with a lot of other residual acids and a lot of other flavors that are just naturally on the grain that add a little bit more dynamic components to it. If it's just for pH correcting, is it going to be super noticeable? Probably not, but it's our preferred way to do it. Is it humanly possible to perform a sit-up with a blindfold on? Yes, for sure. I saw it in, what's that, Little Rascals? No, what's the Little Rascals, something like that. One of those old movies. Let me know what movie I'm thinking about, and I think you know the reference where they make the kid do a sit-up, and then might have been the baseball one, whatever that one is.
We get the Funky Brewer says he has a hard time drinking 5-gallon batches of beer fast enough. I would say... and he's asking, he says that we generally don't recommend smaller batches. I would say either give your beer away to more friends, or, you can scale down. When we kind of bash on small batches, we generally bash on the 1-gallon batches. If you want to scale down to like a 3-gallon batch, I don't think that's going to be the end of the world for you. For the most part, you can buy like 2.5, 3-gallon kegs too, which can make things pretty straightforward for you. But it's usually the 1-gallon batches that we kind of like stay away from because it's such little beer for so much work.
Someone's asking, whatever happened to browns and ambers and why doesn't anyone brew them anymore? Well, we have 2 of them on tap, but I think the biggest answer to that is going to be everyone's like, ooh, shiny, and they want to do the biggest, newest thing.
They do.
And ambers are the oldest, least interesting thing right now.
Yeah. And it's one of those things that they don't sell on a commercial standpoint, except for the one we have. It's actually selling like crazy, but Little Giants, lots of comments come out of.
Hard to find a good ESB as well. I agree, it is hard to find a good ESB. A lot of people don't brew classic Englishies.
Ooh. Stay tuned for next week.
Imperial Yeast recently dropped WO4 Paramount yeast for hard seltzers. Do you guys have any knowledge or experience using it? We do have that yeast in. I'm guessing
2 days ago.
Yeah, I'm guessing it's going to be the exact same as like a champagne style yeast that you are used to seeing for a lot of seltzers, and so
it's actually not supposed to be. Based on what they describe, it's some variant of like a fruity wine strain.
Either way, it's going to be a wine strain, so I'm skeptical as to its efficacy versus something like a Lutra, versus especially our favorite, which is the French Saison.
Yeah.
That said, we will be experimenting with it and trying it out.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Crystal versus roasted malts for color. How do they compare when targeting the same SRM? Do some come across more red and some more brown at the same SRM? Yes, Jimmy, they do. So crystal versus roasted malts. There is a natural like kind of astringency or earthiness that comes off of using even just a little bit of like roasted barley, for example. So even within roasted malts, I'll switch with which roasted malt I'm using depending on what flavor I want. If I want more brown ale kind of vibes, I'm going to go with a roasted barley, a black malt, even some chocolate malts.
Covfefe.
If coffee malt, whatever, which is a pseudo crystal malt. If I want, more amber vibes, more of that building sweetness, the roasted malt that I use for color correction is going to be like pale chocolate or even like a low Carafa 1 or Carafa 2. A little bit of black Prince. So those are going to be the things that are like easier for color correction. Darker crystal malts can be used really well for color correction, and a lot of times if I'm doing amber, something in that C120 range will work really well because you have to use a less amount of it to get that nice red pop. But even then, I'm probably going to be using something like Special X instead.
Yeah.
Or
I love pale chocolate, man. It's
chocolate.
like that little tool that you always forget is in the back of the box, and then you're like, oh wait, I've got this. Yeah, I love chocolate. Yeah, I love using it in just like really small amounts too,
because it backs off the flavor. It's not like the darker chocolate where it's like, yeah, it's still a little bit burnt.
Yeah, and we use Baird's, which is definitely on the dark end of the chocolate malt spectrum too. It's like 400 Lovabond or something.
Little Giants, someone got it.
That was all those comments. I was wondering what that was.
I was trying to get the So because they make the kid do a sit up and then blindfolded, and then he has to. He gets a nice little toot in the face. What do you guys use to take gravity readings, and what do you think of refractometers? So refractometers, I think, are a great tool if you're trying to get sparge or mash efficiency. If I'm taking gravity readings, normally 9 times out of 10, so obviously post-fermentation, but even pre-fermentation, I'm going to use hydrometers for consistency. But refractometers is going to be like if you're sparging and you want to know if you've got enough sugars left in your grain to keep sparging and make it worth it, then that's why I use refractometers.
We got James is wondering if a 1 hour lag time is too short of a lag phase after making yeast starters and pitching them, and I guess he's wondering, and the answer is definitely no. But the reality is that's because
24-hour starters.
Yeah, that's because you've already gone through your lag phase.
Lag phase is really like 4 to 6 hours, and then you have log phase, which log phase is what you're actually looking for. That's going to be the active growth phase, and that can last anywhere from 24 to 36 hours. Usually, it's done before 24 hours, and so 24 hours is usually a fine starter time.
Yeah, and that's actually exactly why we usually recommend doing a starter 24 hours is because by then you should be in that log phase, and the reason why you're seeing airlock activity is because you're pitching actively fermenting yeast into the beer, so they're hitting that fresh wort. They're seeing more sugars, and they're just going nuts, and that's actually exactly what you're trying to do. So,
and someone's already asking the next kind of part of this question, which is, should I pitch the whole starter or just the contents of the slurry? We don't crash our starters. We like that activity to keep going, and so we'll pitch the whole starter. That doesn't matter what scale we're doing. If we have a 2 liter going into a 5 gallon, or if we've got a 5 gallon starter going into a 7 barrel, we're always pitching the whole starter.
Yeah, and it does come to a point. So if you're doing, say you do like a 1 gallon starter on something that you're really trying to build the cells up to, that might be worth crashing it out, just because at that point you're going to be diluting the beer. But
by quite a bit. But
for like a typical 1 liter or even a 2 liter starter, it's usually not enough to worry about dilution at that point. If you've got the time for a 2 liter starter, sure. But it's definitely not hurting anything by throwing it into the actual beer. So
Are double IPAs dead for on-site consumption? I'm going to say no, but if we have a double IPA and a single IPA on tap, the single IPA will probably outsell the double IPA. However, if we have a double, a single, and a session IPA, the session IPA will do the worst.
Yep. Yeah, it's one of those weird things too. Where people, they want to get their bang for their buck, unfortunately.
So it's a shout out for Chili. Nice.
Where'd the homebrew for life question go? He was
would love to share more beer, but I hate bottling any new methods. Beer gun's still the best. Beer gun works. There's actually a couple of counter pressure methods. There's one that was done by Mosky Homebrew, and they actually sent us, the maker of the company sent us a little counter pressure thing that you can fill off a tap, basically, that we'll put together a video on sometime as well. But there's counter pressure ways that are not the beer gun that are probably just as good, if not better. How does Genus remove chlorine? Someone's having some major chlorine issues. So it kind of depends on the water that you're coming from. If you have diatomic chlorine in your water, which is what we have, pre-boiling is all you need to do. If you have chloramines or a consistent chlorine flavor, you need to use Camden tablets, or my favorite method is just going to be a carbon filter in line. That said, the same flavors or the same off flavors that chlorine can create can come from other water source issues. For example, hose water flavor is kind of similar. And so if you just have something in line that's giving you a leaching effect, that could be from something else. Heavyweights with Ben Stiller. Yeah, there we go. It might have been done in multiple things.
I'm glad you're big. I'm just like, what are these random comments on here?
What is the best water profile to work off for a smoked Helles?
Ooh, that's a great one.
Pilsner with some sodium chloride.
Yeah, a little bit
harder
than a typical Pilsner. Yeah. That's another one we need to. I was just thinking about doing. I don't know. Let us know if you like the Pilsner versus Czech Pale Lager, because I'm thinking about doing the same thing with Helles versus Kolsch. I feel like would be another good one, where people are like, wait, what? But those seem really similar.
Can you reuse a yeast cake that has Brett Brux and USO5 in it?
Heck
yes.
Yeah.
The Brett Brux is going to be the slower grower and the slower fermenter, and so you're going to get a dominant USO5 flavor in almost whatever beer you're making. That said, the Brett Brux will have a lot to offer in the final product with just a subtle change. And then you also have to be careful with whether you're bottling or kegging, because it will continue to ferment even after the beer is done. And so let's say you let it sit for 3 months, you're going to have a different beer and a very, very carbonated beer.
Perfect. I think we're just about caught up.
Yeah, I think we're all caught up.
And it is 10 o'clock.
So let's go ahead and get this thing closed up. If you haven't already liked this video, please like this video. Someone has disliked this video. That works too. We have 205 people watching right now.
Me.
Which is a peak concurrent. That's one of our best peak concurrents we've ever had. So thank you so much to everyone who has tuned in. I challenge you all to go, after watching this video, to our lobster beer video and watch that twice. Share it with your grandmother. And also share it on every single forum that you've ever heard of ever on Reddit.
Share it with your small children, since we did not take out the swear words in that one.
Logan, finish out the subscribing things.
All right. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And just a reminder to everyone that we do this every single week at Sunday morning at 8:45 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Feel free to support us through our links to our website. We've got some awesome swag. We've got some recipe kits on there. And tune in next week. I think we'll be going over general cask ales next week, and including London ESB styles and some other styles that are really designed to be brewed as a real ale and put on tap. So thank you very much. And again, we will see you next week on Genus Brewing. Am I done?